everyone. Hi, everyone. So, I cannot find my book anywhere since I um, came back from being out of town after evacuating my house. Um, Fortunately, my house did not burn, and I am back and I am dusting off everything. There's a lot of dust. Ooh. But it's good. I'm resetting my whole reality. It's really good. So, I want to talk about my mom. I was watching a video about seniors in homes, and how they've been cut off from their families. And I was watching a video call with a man and his mother, and it just freaking broke my heart, man. I was just like, whoa. She was still very cognizant and coherent. And I mean, she was probably like in her late 80s, early 90s, right? And she was very cognizant and very, together in her comprehension of things. But what she couldn't wrap her head around was the fact that nobody was coming to see her in the home like they had up until that point. And now it's been 6 months since she's seen anyone in her family. And this deeply triggered me because my own mother. So let me tell you a story about my mom. So my mom died at 68 years old. She died young. She suffered a grand mal seizure at 60 years old. And from that point forward, she began to decline very rapidly. And I didn't put her in a home, but my family chose to put her in a assisted living home. But it wasn't really an assisted living home so much as it was like a mental hospital or a mental ward on some level, where they were giving her tons of drugs. And I would say they were abusive. I mean, wasn't close by enough to be able to check on her on a weekly basis. I was living in an entirely different place. So my sister brought her to around where she lived, which was hours away from where I was, and placed her in a home. And I'm trying to think of the name of the drug that they gave her. It's just not coming to me. And I was trying to think of it before I started this video because I wanted to talk about this drug that they put her on. So basically, she's 60 years old. They end up putting her in a home. And then I proceeded to, I got a phone call from my sister like, it's your job to come take care of the house. Click. My mom had fallen and cracked her head open and almost died. And my sister found her the next day and she had bled out on the couch. Thank God my sister had gone to check on her in the house that I grew up in the next morning, or she probably would have died. And that began this whole series of things that happened to her, which didn't make any sense. And my sister and I were both very confused about the diagnoses that she was getting. And this went on for 8 years it went on. And I was in my 20s when this happened. So here I am in my 20s, going to acting school in Hollywood, and having to drive 3 hours 3 hours each way, back and forth 3 times a week to go and work 17 hours a day, unpacking the house that I grew up in, going through everything, and deciding what needed to be released and gotten rid of, and then, keeping what was valuable and being able to sell it so that we could make money for her to be in this home, right? And I ended up finding a buyer for the house and doing this huge yard sale and making a ton of money, like thousands of dollars. And there's just so many levels to this. But anyway, I don't want to speak poorly of my family, but it was literally like on my head, to take care of this, because I was the only person that didn't have children at the time, who didn't have a family, who didn't have something going on. I did, but in their minds, I was just the person that was going to handle this. So I had to basically be the Cinderella of the family and go clean house. And so I spent 3 solid months doing this, 17 hours a day, driving back from LA to my hometown and dismantling the life that we had all made together as a family. But they had already come in and basically taken whatever, they chose whatever they wanted and left the rest for me to deal with, right? They basically dumped it off on me. And I'm not a victim. I just, I didn't know, I didn't have boundaries then. I didn't know how to stand up for myself. And this was part of me learning that, and learning that I had to take care of myself, because I was going to acting school and I had to pay for it, and I had to pay rent. And, I was driving my old car, and my old car was starting to fall apart. And my sister was just going to take the money and expected me to do everything for free. And I'm like, I got to pay the rent, sister. Are you going to give me a portion of all the money that I just earned? And I just found a buyer for the house. And she was so reluctant to give me any money at all. And I had literally been spending every dime that I had to drive back and forth, and gas. And I mean, it's tanks of gas each way. So all the while, my mother is in a home now, and I've been traumatized, right? Because, we don't know if she's going to make it, or we don't know what's going to happen with her. And I ended up, another expense, I ended up taking everything and moving it to Los Angeles and putting it in storage in another city within Los Angeles, in Long Beach or somewhere super far away from where I lived, in a storage container, and paying for it for 2.5 years. I think back about this time in my life and I'm like, holy shit, dude. I don't even know how I did what I did. I don't even know how I survived this. It was so traumatic. First, I lost my mom, right? And one day she was normal, the next day she wasn't. And then I had to go and deal with the house I grew up in, and she had fallen and cracked her head open, and I went into this sort of cyclothymic sort of up and down, up and down, up and down mood swing thing. I was in complete trauma. PTSD, right? Not knowing that I had PTSD or what PTSD even was, right? And the PTSD was actually trauma from something else that I wasn't aware of in my conscious mind at that time. So here I am, I've lost my mom, and I'm expected to do all this stuff because I don't have children, right? And nobody thanked me. Nobody was appreciative of anything, any of my efforts. And here I am sitting in this empty living room listening to the clock tick, one of those grandfather clocks ticking in the living room. And I just remember sitting there on this gold velvet couch, right? And just, it wasn't the gold velvet couch. It was the couch in the living room. So I was sitting on the couch in the living room, and I just remember just stopping, after been working 17-hour days. I just remember sitting there for a moment in the dead silence of this house that I grew up in, right? And everything just sort of stopped. And I could hear the grandfather clock. And the passing of time, you know? And I realized in that moment that my life would never be the same again. I was 27 years old. It was 1996. My mom had basically gone away. I didn't have my mom anymore. And I was on my own because my dad and my sister, they were way too busy to care about my life or anything related to it. And I just sat there, and the weight of the burden of the house and my dad refinancing the house 5 times and leaving my mom with this burden, this financial burden that like buried her, right? And him not caring at all, did not apologize, didn't care, it didn't even like, he cared less, you know? He had moved on with his life and had a new wife and family, and like my mom was literally left with the ruins of our life, and would cry herself to sleep at night, you know, and just the sadness I could feel in the space, and the sadness and the depths of despair that I felt in that living room was profound. And it wasn't a darkness that I felt as much as it was a desperation for me as her child. And all the ways that she had cared for me and cared about me and went through all of these things that she could never talk about because she was frightened for her life and for my life. And so she was never able to tell me what had happened to me. She tried many times, but she was never able to. And then at that point is when I realized that whatever happened to me in my past, in my childhood, was real. And that there was nothing that anybody was ever going to say to me that would change that. Because I could feel all the levels of it in the house. The walls were screaming at me, screaming at me. The walls of the house that I grew up in were screaming at me. And I started to have visions from that point forward. Hold on, there's something in my eye. It woke me up to a new level of my life that I'd sort of been denying, I guess, because I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to deal with her either. I used to push her away because she was so lonely and she really needed me, you know, and I was trying to break free and I was trying to have a life. I was trying to find my way in the world and basically become famous, right? That was my plan anyway. And so there was this desperate need for me to call her and to check in with her, and she was just overly protective of me, like extreme, you know, and smothering on some level. But now knowing what I know and understanding all the levels of what happened to me as a child, now I understand why she was so overprotective and why she was completely and utterly frightened to her core for me as a person, and what she could have possibly witnessed in that process. She fought for me so hard to save me from my father, and to try to get me away from him. And I ended up going and living with him in my teenage years because she was so smothering and so like just like, you know, sticky, you know, and I just couldn't breathe. I was just like, I can't do this. And my sister had also left in her teens and went to live with my father as well. And I can't even imagine now, looking back, how heartbreaking that must have been for her, knowing what I know now about what happened and what happened in my life and how I was used and utilized by secret military programs and sexually abused and all of those levels, right? And so I can't even imagine what that must have been like for her as a mother. But now I can, because I have a child who's a teenager, and I can see how, and I have friends that have children, right? And as mothers, we look at all these levels now, right? Like we look at all the levels of how children are being utilized as 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 energy batteries for the dark, and humans in general, but definitely the children, right? And the trafficking and the hypersexualization of children, and pornography and video games and alternate realities, and like anything to keep them out of their center, to keep them out of their own personal wisdom and really being able to check in with themselves on the deepest levels, right? So that they can fortify themselves as a human being and have reasoning skills and critical thinking skills and all those levels, right? My mother feared for my life, and she understood that I may never make it. She also understood how strong I was. And so she never said to me that I wasn't going to make it. Whereas my father, that's all he did. But she did the opposite of that. She never ever spoke down to me. She never talked to me in a way that was critical, ever, like ever. She believed in me as a fundamental human being. She believed in my capacity to survive. And I believe that's because she saw what I went through and that I survived it all. But she didn't. She took the brunt end of the stick for me. And she was a martyr, like a fundamental martyr. She didn't like play the role as martyr. She actually was the martyr. And she still expressed unconditional love for me and for my sister and even for my dad. And considering what the entire family put her through, it's mind-blowing to think about, like how kind and loving she was, and that she was this pure spirit, this pure light, just pure freaking light. and she was a Sophia consciousness. She was she had a Mother Mary energy to her. She had a virginal energy to her. She was very innocent in her way. Just something about her was just so incredibly soft. And I am very different than that. I am a much harder. I am more masculine, and yet I'm feminine, right? But I have this strength of a commander. I have this strength of a like a leader who will not back down and will stand at the front lines, and I will fight, and she didn't have that. But she fought for me, for my right to have that. That's huge. That was her only fight. For whatever reason, she chose that fight to be her fight. And I feel forever indebted to her for that, because I don't think that I would be here right now if it wasn't for her love for me. The love of a mother literally informs our reality in a way that we can't understand or express or even comprehend at times until way later in our lives. And so, as a mother myself, I am falling way short of that, of what my mother was for me, like way short. I am just not the same kind of mother. And I am still allowing myself to be who I am as a mother, which is a huge step for me, because I wasn't with my son for 9 years, and I beat myself up hard for that. It was the most difficult thing I've ever done to leave him, and then, to come back around, right? And now processing all of that, like processing a little bit of his life, of his memories of that time when I wasn't with him. I mean, I saw him every year, but I wasn't in his everyday life. But the emotional and psychological and physical results, I should say, of that, and the things that took place that I had no control over or any part of, have really informed him in a way that I need to respect and love and understand, even if I don't have any clue about some of those or all of those details. I still need to respect his experience. And this is something that my mother did for me. She respected my experience. And my father did not. He discounted my experience at every possible turn. Every possible turn. No matter what it was. It didn't matter. What I think he thought he was doing was perfecting and polishing a diamond, right? I think in his mind, that was the way that he interpreted what he was doing, was to create a diamond from the rough. And on some level, it did do that, right? But on another level, the hurdles and the anvils that I had to take off of my body in order to just function as a normal human being were profound. Like, for me to just have a job and make money was almost impossible. Like, it was really hard. And I worked my ass off. I had 3 jobs, worked 7 days a week, couldn't make enough money to survive. And the lack consciousness was so severe in me that I could barely breathe. I could barely keep my head above water. And now I still struggle with that on some level, but in a different way, because now I trust. I trust Source. I trust the infinite wisdom of my monadic source seed, my connection with spirit, my spirit moving in through and as me and operating as me. And my mother had that despite everything that she went through, despite all the abuse that she endured, despite everything that happened to her, including the grand mal seizure, which was a trigger that was set off in her brain purposely, and then the slow kill that she went through for 8 years. And if you know what that is, then you'll understand what I'm talking about. But it became evidently clear, especially after, I mean, before my dad died, but after my dad died and me witnessing what he went through as well, and understanding the military industrial complex and the way that they operate, and the deep state and the CIA and the undercover agencies, I was able to understand on a very deep level the level of mind control that my father was under, and the oath that he was sworn under till death, right? And then communicating with him from the other side, so the more that I understood how this all works and how it has influenced and shaped our society and mind control and how humans are being trafficked, it became very clear to me that my father specifically was a product of that system. And my mother was a victim of that product of the system, right? So, and then I was a victim of that system as well. And I, fortunately for me, did not become a product of that system. I was able to somehow, some way, I was able to step out of it. I mean, not without scratching at the walls of the freaking, cell, right? Solitary confinement in my consciousness. But somehow, some way, I managed to scratch my way out and to break down thick walls of blackness, and to rip through, to find the light, to just rip through all the levels of darkness and just tear down those walls over and over and over and over and over again. So now it's second nature. I just go, poof, you're not welcome here. You have no jurisdiction here. Stand down. In accordance with the cosmic sovereign law of one, you have no jurisdiction. You have no power. Be gone. Because there is no other power within us other than our source light energy, our divinity, as organic human beings living on this planet, period. We're organic human souls embodied within these flesh body temples that we need to take care of, that we need to cherish and love. And that doesn't just mean physically, that means emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and physically. And all these other ways too, energetically. So I feel so incredibly blessed that my mother was able to withstand the level of punishment and abuse that she did to her detriment. And I feel horrible about it as well. But I also understand, because when she passed over the other side, she came to me, right? And she said, we are like two oxen pulling a plow. And that really stuck with me. Like our souls were on this journey together, right? And we were like these two oxen, right? Pulling this plow together, and we were a team. And I never understood that her and I specifically were a team. And that has stuck with me all of these years because I know that she's still working with me from the other side. She's doing all kinds of stuff over there. And she came to me in a session recently and she spoke to me about a lot of levels. And I was so stunned to even connect with her that I just, I wept. I wept. I was like struck to tears. I didn't expect her to show up, you know. It's a beautiful thing when you've made that level of heart resonance connection with another human being to be able to have that level of communication from the other side of that door. You can have a conversation through the door. And full concepts and sentences, not like, one word or a picture. We're talking like an entire conversation, And so what I think is important to realize is that we don't know where that veil, where that's going to get thinned out enough that we can see through to the other side of it. We don't actually know how much of that veil needs to be lifted. The veil is being lifted right now. There's no question about the fact that the veil is being completely lifted off. It cannot go back down. The veil has been lifted. The veil's been ripped off. And we're ripping it off really slowly, is how it appears to some of us. For me, it looks like it's going really slow. But to other people, it's going really fast. And it's like, like it's coming off. The Band-Aid is getting ripped off, and there's no way that the Band-Aid is going back on. There needs to be fresh air on that wound to dry it out because it's pussy and it's disgusting. And it needs the sunlight to be exposed to it so that it can heal. That is where we're at. And it's not about Q. It's not about Trump. It's not about Biden. It's not about Kamala Harris. It's not about the Democrats. It's not political. It is the consciousness fields literally shifting. The Schumann resonance is off the charts on a weekly basis now, like off the scale for hours at a time. Whiteouts. This has never happened in history before. This is the first time that this has ever done this on this scale so consistently and so repeatedly and frequently in history since the Schumann resonance has been measured. There isn't a time in history where it has been like this. Now, remembering that the planetary bodies are influencing this as well. And these squares and these alignments and these conjunctions, those all have happened before, but not for a very long time. And during those times, there's been recorded history. And during those times, they've recorded that certain things have happened, right? Certain types of things have happened based on subjects and in relation to these events. So we do have that history, and that history itself is revealing itself right now in the collective, in our experience. So we are having some planetary influence that is actually showing up in the collective experience, right? And so there's a lot more people that are trusting the science of astrology way more than they used to, because they can see now that there's a pattern that's been recorded, scientifically speaking. There's an actual recorded pattern of behavioral events that have taken place throughout history that are directly connected to the alignments of the planets. You can't deny that. That's not a conspiracy. That's real. What is also real is we've been through a sun cooling before. We've been through a solar minimum before, which is what is happening now in the solar minimum. There's a point in the solar minimum where it flashes, okay? And the sun, they say that the sun is dying. So, and another aspect, we've been going into the photon band of light, which is more towards the center of the galactic Milky Way galaxy, the galactic sun being Alcyon, right? So we have this photon band of light, and then there's supposed to be these 3 days of darkness. What I'm getting intuitively is that we just went through 3 years, 3.5 years of darkness, and now we're entering into the photon band of light from the null zone. And the null zone is this band where there's no light at all. And so during that time, we needed an artificial sun and an artificial moon to be able to keep everything in the status quo. But also right before we went into the null zone, the veil got ripped off. So what started to happen is we started to see, and more was revealed to us. And because more was able to be seen, then they came in with the dark magic, right? And they ended up putting dark magic spells and lulling everybody to sleep. Because the celestial speed up was happening, and it was happening so fast that they implemented all these things like, distractions like consumer sales and like online sales and like all these things like boom, 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 just to keep you totally distracted from what was really going on this entire time. And now we're on the other side of the null zone, and we're in the photon band of light. And now we're seeing the real sun again on certain days. And then on other days, we're not seeing it at all. We're seeing an artificial sun. So it is so complex, and people just, they don't even realize what's going on, man. It is real what's going on, like for real. And then also the Stargate system we've been working on that system, activating the magnetic light grid of the Earth and establishing a solidified container of light around, in, and through the planet for the last several years. And as a result of that, the darkness can't grab a hold anymore, because the liquid plasma light that has filled in those spaces, those empty holes, if you will, or transmuted any sort of densities or whatever's been in lockdown, it's now at a level where it cannot be contained anymore, and you can no longer implement the dark magic the same way that you could before, that was implemented over thousands of years. Okay, so now we're at a point where they can't do that anymore. So now when they put something in front of you to try to fool you, you're not really going to fall for it the same way that you would have 3 years ago. 3 years ago, we were asleep. 2016, 4 years ago, we were asleep. We may have thought we were awake, but we were asleep. For real. It wasn't until the human trafficking veil started to get lifted and we worked directly on that veil lifting that we could start to see what was really going on. So this has all been planned for a really, 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 really long time. Like a really long time. Over a long time, but specifically in the last 100 years, right? And so 120 years from the turn of the century in the mid 1800s. And what I have come to understand is there was something called the mud flood. So in 1859, and I'm just kind of rambling here because I really want to get this out. In 1859, there was something called the Carrington event, which was a solar flash event. What I believe happened and resulted from that was something called the mud flood. So we had the old world, which was magnificent, beautiful buildings, and this civilization was called Tartaria, Tartaria. And in that civilization, there were giants, there were dragons, there were magical beings, there were little persons, there were all sizes, shapes of people. There were, interactions with extraterrestrial beings. All of that was going on. There were high-speed trains. There was all kinds of things happening. And then the mud flood happened and wiped out a huge portion of the population, and all these children were left without their parents. And they had these orphan trains. And then they put all these young children, these orphans, into these homes, these elaborately built buildings that had been built, right? And you can see on some of them, on these buildings, that the floor, the surface of the earth goes up. And then you'll see the tops of the windows, right, that have now been turned into the basement windows, those little basement windows. Well, those actually were entire floors, right? And they've been turned into basements, and the surface of the earth comes up to, just below the second floor, which is now the first floor. This happened all over the world. There's buildings in New Zealand, there's buildings in Chicago, there's buildings all over the world. The world fairs in the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, there were these magnificent buildings that had been built. You can go on Instagram and look under the hashtag mudflood or Tartaria, Tartaria, and you can see the old world. You can see these buildings and this situation, and it's all been hidden. And so all of those children were taught from childhood, right? They no longer had parents. They were all orphans. They all became the adults that then started to run the world, right? So they were taught whatever these people that were in charge, the controllers, chose to teach them. And that's when 1913, in 1930, the Federal Reserve was established, right? Like the Rothschilds took over, basically. And this world system was established that only really benefited the Rothschilds. Like all the money funneled through and ended up in the Rothschilds' hands, or anybody that was connected to those bloodlines. That is no longer the case. Now, what's currently happening on the planet, which I want to talk about really briefly, is there's a global financial reset happening, and there are 209 countries that have signed on to GESARA, the Global Economics, Securities, and Reformation Act, which has very specific stipulations in it and parameters in order to be enacted. And in order for the world to be at peace. So the world cannot have any wars going on in order for GESARA to be fully implemented. Also, the GESARA is designed to be implemented prior to the election, if it's in an election year. There's all these stipulations. So here we are. We have the Democrats and the Republicans, we have the deep state, we have the Christians, we have the evil, we have the Luciferians, and we have the Christians. We have all these people battling against each other. And then we have the deep state attempting to divide and conquer the collective through all these issues, from race to religion to Nazism to communism to socialism to, people pointing the finger from one side to the other. We need to come together and unite. We need to drop all the rhetoric and just be human beings for real. Like, human beings are we're all here together, and this is a matter of life and death for us. This is a matter of humanity surviving. It is at that point, because what's going to happen if they keep pushing the way that they're pushing with no regard for human life, those that do regard human life, that's a sleeping giant. And they are going to come up and they are going to retaliate. And then there will be full out war. Because the real warriors are the ones that have held back and sat back and watched all this go down and refrained from getting involved. And once you wake up those sleeping giants, all bets are off. And the reason I know this is because I lived it. And I do live it every day. And I know many people like me who do that, who are that. So we are warriors, we're soldiers. We're trained for this. And I'm not just talking spiritually, I'm talking physically. It's hard for people to wrap their heads around the fact that some of us have been refraining from getting involved on purpose. But now is the time to find the level of discernment to understand how you can act without having to cause war or be a part of the war, but in order to bring forward the consciousness of humanity, to propel it forward in a way that the awakening happens, so that we can actually shift the consciousness of the collective. Because that is actually what's happening. And that is the prime directive of this time period and what's happening on the planet right now. Regardless of however anybody else is reacting, the prime influence here is light and love. And it's really difficult for people to focus on that when they are in a state of fear or shock or distraction. So as long as they can keep us distracted, then we won't be focusing on what the actual goal is, right? Or the end result, or whatever that looks like. And what's important to remember is that they are not in control. There is a divine directive here. And when we align ourselves with our own divine directive and the prime objective of spirit, then we can open the way for those who want to engage with that. We can open the road. We can say, here's the road. We don't have to do it for them. In fact, we can't do it for them. But what we can do is walk on the road and say, hey, here's the road. You're welcome to join us. And here's the open road. It's open. Anybody's available. Anybody's welcome. And there's only one thing, which is that in order to be on the road, you must be listening to your own divine directive, right? So there's an opportunity there to listen to yourself, to be in your own wisdom. And that is what my mother taught me. That is what she showed me by example. She never doubted her own truth. She got beaten up for it, but she never doubted it, not for 1 second. And that I respect wholeheartedly with every fiber of my being. And that's what taught me to trust my gut beyond anyone's words. What my source seed tells me, what my source seed connects, and my direct guidance, my direct knowing that comes directly from source, that is the only voice that I have and that I want to listen to. And I invite everyone to do that right now, to really tap in to that place that is eternal and changeless within you, that is ever present, and listen. There's a lot there. And when you're listening and you're able to receive rather than overriding with your intelligence, your, blah, 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 if you just sit back a little bit and allow yourself to receive this guidance and this wisdom, that original thought form, that original voice that comes from deep within the wells of your beingness, your wisdom, your wells of wisdom, you can't deny that. You know it resonates in every fiber of your being as truth. And that's the clarity that we need right now. Above and beyond everything else, the clarity of our own wisdom and our own truth is the only voice that we should be listening to, ever. Deep gratitude for my mom, my mother, my beautiful mother. I'm super grateful for her, and I miss her a lot. I can't say I miss her every day because I do connect with her and have communication, so that it helps me to not miss her. It helps me to be fully present to her and available for communication, and that way death is not really a finality in the equation of my mother and I's connection or consciousness and communication and relationship as souls, because we're still communicating. And that is important. Woo! Thank you for listening to my rant. I appreciate you. I'm grateful that you spent your time here with me. I mean, you can choose to watch anything, basically. There's a million things to watch right now, but you're choosing to spend some time and presence with me, and I'm grateful for that. I have no idea who's listening, but thank you for being here, and I will see you next time. Blessings. Bye-bye.